Hello. Okay, I think we can start. Welcome everyone. I really appreciate that you're all here. I know it's Sunday, it's noon. It's lots of reasons not to be here, especially with whatever was happening the past days. I think I'm happy that there's so many people. First, I want to welcome Sam Hardy, who accepted my invitation to take part in this talk. Sam is an archaeologist specializing in antiquity lootings and destruction of archaeological sites. So the way I thought about this presentation, I'm gonna talk a little bit, actually present some notes, ideas, reflections that I had for the past year and a half that I've been working on archaeology. This project actually started with a production grant that I got from Sharjah to do a film in the desert on a 5,000-year-old necropolis in the Sharjah desert. So the film is called The Digger. It's going to be screening tomorrow at 6 at Beirut Art Center. So also you're most welcome to come tomorrow. So I'm going to present these ideas, reflections. My intention is trying to look at the archaeological project of preservation that started with modernity and to trace its, all the way to what's happening today with the destruction of sites, mainly in Syria, Iraq, in Libya as well, in this part of the world. And then I'm going to give the floor to Sam, who's going to talk about the work he's been doing on trafficking and antiquity looting. And then the idea is to open this discussion, so it's not just me and Sam having this discussion. I'm hoping that things that we're going to talk about are going to trigger people to get involved in this. Especially this is an ongoing project, so I'll be more than happy to discuss everything that I'll be talking about. Okay, so we can start.
Quand les hommes sont morts, ils entrent dans l'histoire. Quand les statues sont mortes, elles entrent dans l'art. Cette botanique de la mort, c'est ce que nous appelons la culture. C'est que le peuple des statues est mortel. Un jour, nos visages de pierre se décomposent à leur tour. Une civilisation laisse derrière elle ses traces mutilées comme les cailloux du petit pousset, mais l'histoire a tout mangé. Un objet est mort quand le regard vivant qui se posait sur lui a disparu, et quand nous aurons disparu, nos objets iront là où nous envoyons ceux des nègres, au musée. Quand les hommes sont morts,
I've always saw ruins as cemeteries. Like many, I assimilate archaeology to digging, although this constitutes less than 10% of what an archaeologist does. But I think there's a fascination with the gesture. We should not forget that the uncanny lies in the act of digging up, not in the property of being buried. Burying is what we naturally do. Unearthing the earth is by definition an uncanny act. Anyone or anything buried in the ground is in the realm of the dead, and to excavate or exhume is a transgressive gesture. In 1835 in Egypt, and in a legal clarification about the status of mummies, the local authorities declared, since the law did not say anything about the mummies of the infidels, and in the absence of a clear ban, we do not forbid its exportation. Man-made objects were defined as artifacts and protected. but not human remains, even if they were mummified. So it wasn't before 1851 that they started considering human remains as archaeological relics. We have moved now from the dichotomy between archaeologist and artist, where archaeology treats the object as an index, whereas art deals with it as a symbol or an icon. Material culture forms today the bedrock of archaeology, and this idea of codependency among mind, action, and matter opens the way for a new and dynamic approach to all material culture, both past and present. Reclaiming materiality comes from the realization that things are not failed texts, but they are rather valuable evidence in themselves. It's not that archaeology reveals alternative stories. The point is that there are things that can only be accessed through materiality. There are gaps, shadows, silences, and absences which are not simply outside discourse, but are often structurally excluded from discourse. But how does this distinctly modernist culture of objects intersect the history of archaeology itself? When I started to have interest in archaeology, I wanted to look at the place of the archaeological object in mechanism of producing history. From the moment of digging up the artifact, a transgressive gesture that brings out the uncanny, to the moment they are put in a museum display. The moment an object is unearthed, like Hamlet in the gravedigger scene, holding Yorick's skull and addressing it, or better, like the opening of the mouth ritual in ancient Egypt, we ask the object to open its mouth for the last time and to tell us what happened, to tell us how things were. We hold the artifact witness to our ideological imagination and founding mythologies. We ask it to speak the truth of the genealogical history that commands the life of our forefathers onto the present, but we ask it also to provide the spatial and demographic contours of nationhood, institutionalized in the state. Once these objects have spoken, we put them in the theater of history behind exquisitely lit, precisely labeled glass boxes to be dead again and forever. But these archaeological objects have always been questioned since the start of the modernist project. For example, the Manifesto of Futurism launched an appeal for a worship of the future against the fetid cancer of professors, archaeologists, tourist guides, and antique dealers. When Tristan Tzara first put together the emancipatory nature of Dada's work of demolition, almost 1 decade after Maniretti, the archaeologists remain in the line of fire. Dada, every object, all objects, feelings and obscurities, every apparition and the precise shock of parallel lines are means of the battle of Dada, the abolition of memory, Dada, the abolition of archaeology. Instead of feeding necrophilia, the archaeological finds refuse to be absorbed into grand narrative and nation building, science or progress, joys and traumas. This other archaeology wanted to free objects from the burden of having to signify, to function, to be accessible or available. It treasures the duplicity of archaeological objects, their moments of decontextualizing and recontextualizing. In being dug out and ripped from its ground, the old object holds the potential of producing the effect of the new, because its very detachment and alterity. Here I can give the example of the journal Cahiers d'Art from 1926, founded by Zervos. The subtitle of the publication, Revue d'actualité artistique, Review of Artistic Contemporaneity, and it's supposed to show the latest and most cutting-edge artistic production, Braque, Gris, Léger, Matisse, Picasso. The insistence on the modernity of contemporary art goes hand in hand with the presentation of the archaeological object in the power of its alterity. Archaeology shows us not the course of civilization, but the force of object. Modern or ancient are equal. But today, in a not too subtle, pretentious self-proclamation, artists could take the role of an ethnographer, of a historian, of an anthropologist. That's how, for example, we could see in a panel conceived by Hans Ulrich Obrist earlier this year, part of Art Basel Conversation, a panel titled The Artist as Archaeologist, with a lineup of artists ranging from Jumanna Manna to Mariana Costello to Susan Hiller, Rosella Biscotti, Peter Wachtler, and Simone Fattal. For the first chapter of my project, I wanted to work in the desert of Sharjah and Abu Dhabi. As you might know, there's a big hype in archaeological excavations in the Gulf. Of course, these are young countries that are still in the process of writing their history. I thought it would be interesting to see how can one write an alternative history in the desert. Western modernity was built around the city, urban life, commerce, and centers of power. I thought by going to the Arabian desert and with the fragility of the place, I could find alternative narrative and other temporalities than what we see in Western museums today. Unfortunately, this was a missed opportunity, and instead of finding other narratives, I found that Gulf countries reproduce paradigms of Western nations in early modernity. They're trying to link with a pre-nomadic past, so it's not true we're just Bedouins and we found oil and settled and built cities. But we also had our ancient towns and settlements. We also have history museums and archaeological artifacts. We also belong to this international trend. These discourses of origin of a nation are also signs of modernity. The naturalness of bounded people and the belief in their existence in a golden age in the past contribute to the creation of popular nationalism and the notion of national past. I met Sultan Zeib Khan during my visit to Jabal al-Buhis, a 5,000-year-old necropolis site in Sharjah Desert. Sultan is from Pakistan, and he's a caretaker of the site. Sultan has been living in the desert guarding ruins for 20 years, and he participates in archaeological diggings whenever foreign teams are working in the region. In my film, The Digger, I follow Sultan in his daily tours, where he preserves the graves that have been emptied from their content. Graves that are now empty holes in the ground. Graves before becoming graves. Isn't it to save any ruin from its own decay and is essentially to deny its status as a ruin? So why do we preserve? Since the European travelers of the 18th century, the West has invented the ruins. This fascination that appears in texts, paintings, etchings, paved the way to cultural tourism and became an economic profit and prestigious fetish of Occidental regimes. The protection of historical heritage is not natural, but is linked to political and cultural discourse and ideological national or even imperial agendas. We know how Saddam Hussein claimed to be the direct descendant of Akkadians and Assyrians and Babylonian kings. He even carved his face in the restored Babylonian ruins. We remember the slogan, Syria's Assad, the cradle of history, or Egypt, 7,000 years of civilization. These states that hold the symbolic monopoly of the past and its reinstatement, but also hold the monopoly of the corruption in smuggling and dealing historical artifacts. But all this is changing, and as we see the nationalist Arab states collapsing, and from the discourse of early modernity, of national heritage, what govern now are the universal values. Instead of producing singular national narratives, archaeology is now an international spectacle that is reproduced in every place without being inscribed within national geographies. A spectacle that is at first of all linked to the economy of producing codes, signs, and images linked to capitalist profits. We are very far now from when archaeological ruins were silent monuments, inert traces, objects without context, and things left by the past, that could only aspire to the condition of history and attain meaning through the restitution of a historical discourse. These empty sanctuaries are temple for the tourist, always sacred, always desacralized. Sacred because preserved, separated from the living, and desacralized by the flow of visitors with their romantic fantasy. The romantic always wants to be alone among the ruins, while the function of the myth is to hold tight a society with the story of its founding mythology. Françoise Chauvet, in the Invention of the Historical Monument, examines the terminology of heritage conservation, which she dates to after the French Revolution. Because as you know, during the French Revolution, with the destruction of the churches, there was a need for a law to protect these buildings, saying that these do not represent, symbolically represent the authority of the church, but we should preserve them for their historical value. So there was a separation between what's symbolic and what's historical. So Françoise Chauvet, in the Invention of the Historic Monument, examines the terminology of heritage conservation, which she dates to after the French Revolution. She sees the ambivalent character of heritage conservation as a symbol of a capitalist economy, a symptom of deep social malaise, and even a touchstone of the discovery of humanistic values whose relevance for contemporary society can no longer be taken for granted. In an article published in the Financial Times in May 2015, Jonathan Foyle quotes Emma Cunliffe, a specialist in Syrian cultural heritage at Oxford University's Endangered Archaeology of the Middle East and North Africa program. She suggests that equating authenticity with provenance is a Western concept. This may sound odd, as many people hold that crafted manifestation of imagination and effort are irreplaceable by copies. But some cultures routinely rebuild ancient monuments. In Japan, ancient pagodas are celebrated that have been rebuilt perhaps 10 times, but which inherit their original ethos and form, which represent the soul of the object above its materiality. Should we get over our delusion and accept that the patrimony can be replicated? The painstaking rebuilding of Warsaw after the Second World War suggests that we could. This is the end of the quote. The loss that is at the heart of the archaeological project is precisely modernist experience of the 20th century. We seem to be caught between both tendencies, either to safeguard everything or to destroy everything. I want to end with a fascinating story. In 2006, a city museum in Rouen in France, which included a Maori head in its collection, was about to open. The deputy mayor of the city, citing barbaric trafficking in body parts, said the head should be returned. She made contact with the New Zealand's ambassador to France. The museum was furious, arguing that the head was an inalienable part of the French heritage. If it was handed back, it would create a precedent affecting about 15 similar items in other French collections. Then the policymakers made a new legislation, and after a long dispute between the museum staff, backed by the Culture Ministry and the mayor, the Maori Head were returned to New Zealand in 2011. But for scientists, the matter is not settled. The museum director says, "The problem is to define the right perimeter. What is a head? Specifically, there are Maori head, but we also have a great many skulls. The Natural History Museum in Paris has around 18,000 skulls and 30,000 bones in its reserves. Faced with repeated demands of the restitution of human remains, they have established a line of conduct. If an individual is named, they consider the application admissible. The head of Atai, the Kanak chief which led the 1878 insurrection, was returned to the New Caledonia this year because it had been identified. On the other hand, they refused to restitute 4 anonymous heads. Maybe what can preserve the modernist archaeological project is when it starts dealing with its specters and ghosts and realizing its counter-modern potentials. Thank you.
Sorry, I decided to take out some of the most disgusting pictures at the last minute. Thank you for inviting me. It's wonderful to be here. When I started doing research, I was rather hoping to do peace education at historic sites, but it didn't quite work out like that, mainly because the people who lived around the sites weren't desperately keen for me to do it. So I ended up working on destruction and trafficking instead. And in Cyprus, there was a great deal of destruction, both during the civil war and since, while part of it's been under occupation. And as you can see from these photos here, some of the destruction has been very thorough. So the church of Pania Apagu was bulldozed flat, and that photograph came from Turkish Cypriots who've been trying to document the destruction within their own community, but of other communities' heritage. Anti-nationalists who've been trying to resist the loss of the memory and mixed community identity of their villages and towns and cities. On the right, there's a building which is partly standing, at least two walls, but as you can see through the window, the rest of the house is gone already. But the red X is an X mark for destruction, which is how buildings in mixed villages were identified. So, I mean, when I was in Kosovo, people would write on their own houses, this has an Albanian owner, so that extremists from their own community wouldn't accidentally destroy the wrong house. But here it's been done for the destroyers, so that they knew which ones to target. And this is the kind of destruction that gets presented all of the time by archaeologists and historians and other people who are studying the history of the Cyprus conflict, because it's the destruction of the community who now have control of the administration, the Greek Cypriots. But when I started looking at destruction throughout the conflict, other events started to come out that weren't acknowledged in established histories. These are the remains of a mosque and a home in a formerly mixed village. When I went to the village initially, I couldn't find the Turkish Cypriot quarter, and I stopped and tried to ask someone, a local Greek Cypriot woman. But she saw that my car had a Turkish Cypriot number plate on the front. So she asked me, when I asked her where the mosque was, she said there wasn't one. And then she asked me, "Oh, are you a Turk?" And I said, "No, I'm English." And then she said, oh, the mosque's over there. And she gave me a really disturbing walking tour of what used to be the village, taking me to the mosque first of all, which is now where the kids play football, and elsewhere on the same stretch of grass there is a home that was bulldozed, and you can still see where the houses used to be, because the grass grows differently on top of concrete and on top of soil. She even showed me the houses that had been preserved, not out of any sense of community feeling, but because they'd bought them from the refugees as they were leaving. And she explained to me that they'd only paid 70 lira for them, and I thought but apparently my disgust had shown, but she hadn't understood it, and she thought that I literally couldn't understand the numbers she was counting, so she started going 1, 2, 3, and she taught me the entire destruction of this village, but only because she didn't realize that I objected to ethnic cleansing. And since the conflict, one of the big parts of theoretical reconciliation has been the reconstruction of the other communities' cultural heritage. And it is now starting to work bicommunally, with Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots working together to rebuild their lost places from their mixed communities, the most significant sites, in preparation for the rebuilding of a shared life and reunification of the island. But quite often, the targets are very specific, and the effect of the reconstruction seems to be far more for the international community than it is for the local community. So in this village, you can see the school mosque has been beautifully restored, and photos of that are shared around. But if you look behind it and around it, or if you just turn around and take a photograph from the other direction, you can see that the rest of the village is not only in ruins, but is being reused as a farm. Likewise in Vereca, the mosque has been very well preserved, but the homes that the Turkish Cypriots might have naively expected to return to on the reunification of the island aren't exactly in the same state. And it's these kinds of peculiar confidence-building measures that really stood out to me when I was trying to study what had actually been destroyed, why it had been destroyed, and how the communities were teaching themselves and each other about the conflict and the community. And another thing is the way that there is such a massive focus on religious heritage, not only when they don't rebuild domestic architecture, but it's a way of avoiding the intracommunal conflict. So violence between the communities started at the same time or even later than violence within the communities, where right-wing Greek Cypriots and right-wing Turkish Cypriots tried to target and suppress and destroy the left-wing open-minded communities who wanted to share the island. And that was also seen in destruction. So the offices of the Progressive Party of Cyprus were bombed during the Civil War, but that isn't anymore acknowledged in the histories of the conflict, because both the nationalists and the anti-nationalists want to focus on the ethnic conflict rather than what you might see as deeper problems within the communities themselves. And sometimes the propaganda gets very bizarre indeed. So this isn't a photograph that I took when I was visiting sites. This is a photograph I took from a publication of the Republic of Cyprus, where they were showing damaged sites. And this particular building was shown with graffiti on the inside. It's a Greek Cypriot building, and the graffiti is there, and it's in Turkish. But the actual graffiti is a poem which says, "Beauty will save the world, everything begins with the love of one person." And it was a condemnation by Greek Cypriots of nationalists, a condemnation by Turkish Cypriots of nationalist Turkish Cypriots who had been destroying places in their territory. And sometimes the condemnation became even stronger. So I found in more than one place Greek Cypriot cemeteries that had been vandalized, with the crosses smashed and sometimes the graves dug up. On the outside, sometimes Turkish Cypriots, or indeed Turkish settlers, had painted the hand of Fatima on the outside in the hope of inspiring protection, or at least provoking sufficient shame that the nationalists would stop attacking these places. Some Greek Cypriots also had ways of reducing the destruction and damage. This is a Turkish Cypriot mosque with Greece written on it. And the Greece has been whitewashed out. And when I spoke to the person who lived next door, he said that he'd whitewashed it himself, and then said, if the kid does it again, which means if the kid does it again, he'll get a beating, but at least he won't do it again. And one of the other things I found was protection through conversion. This is a photo of a church that was converted to a mosque by a Christian who converted to Islam in Turkey. I can't show you the photo of the church mosque in Cyprus because they didn't want to be identified for understandable reasons, but there was one village where Turkish settlers had come across from a mixed community in Turkey, and when they got to the village in Cyprus, they found that the locals were really nationalistic and had been destroying Greek Cypriot places. So they converted the church into a mosque to put it beyond destruction. And while I was doing all of this work on Cyprus, all of the problems or the latest worst problems in Syria started kicking off. And I started looking at destruction there, checking whether things had been destroyed or who'd been responsible. On one occasion, Islamic State destroyed the Armenian Genocide Memorial Church in Deir ez-Zor. And on that particular occasion, they didn't claim responsibility, mainly because it was at the same time that they'd allowed Turkey to enter territory and recover the remains of the grandfather of the Ottoman Empire. And because they didn't want to show that they were cooperating, they didn't want to show that they'd destroyed this church on, I believe, Armenian Independence Day. So when I released the evidence that the Islamic State had done it, they ripped it off and represented it as the results of an American airstrike. But a lot of their propaganda was a lot more boastful, and a lot of it is targeted archaeological sites. They've taken a lot of material, say, destroying the faces on the Lamassu in Nineveh, and a lot of it is focused around how they are ideologically opposed to images, and it's a matter of religious law that they have to destroy icons. They declared these statues and idols, these artifacts, if God has ordered their removal, they become worthless to us, even if they are worth billions of dollars. And it's something they've tried to show with their attacks on Mosul Museum and Hatra. Christopher Jones, who's also been looking at this stuff, pointed out that some of their propaganda was very carefully cut and edited. And you can understand why in Hatra, because they spent a lot of time shooting guns in an enclosed space where the bullets were ricocheting back towards them. But when experts were looking at these, they started noticing that some objects weren't shown in the propaganda. And obviously, if they're trying to make a show of destroying everything, they can do it quite easily. For Palmyra, they made a big play of saying that they destroyed artifacts that were being smuggled, again, to show that they weren't profiting themselves. The objects turned out genuinely to match up with the Islamic State story, but the reason that they'd been destroyed was quite strange in itself. Basically, the smuggler hadn't wanted to pay the Islamic State tax on smuggling. He'd taken the material to the Turkish border, but then decided it would be a bit too difficult to smuggle through Turkey, so he thought he would double back and take it through Lebanon, actually. But he was rather overconfident, and he was smoking as he went through the Islamic State's checkpoint. And they stopped him because he was smoking. And then when they checked the back of his truck, they found these. In Nimrod, they showed themselves drilling through the walls of the buildings as if they were taking part in urban warfare and trying to avoid being shot by snipers. But obviously, first of all, they were the only people there, and as you can see from their own video, they already had a camera team on the other side of the wall to record themselves coming through. When they got to the palace of Ashurnasirpal II, they carefully laid out all of the photographs of the barrels with the explosives in them, and they showed themselves taking the panels off the wall and dropping them in slow motion to impress all of their fanboys. But you could see when they showed their desired parts of propaganda, it made it look like they destroyed everything. Absolutely everything. The photos were from quite a restricted angle, though. If you look on these, you can see the pile of rubble the wall panels where they took them away from the building. And you can see from the explosion that not only does part of the building survive, but so do all of those wall panels. Again, if they wanted to destroy this rather than sell it, they could have just left it where it was. But, and you can see it again on the satellite images that these wall panels survived, and the Islamic State had made a point of making sure they survived by carrying them away before they blew anything up, which shows part of their desire to preserve cultural property, at least if it can be sold. One of the disturbing things that came out around all of this destruction was an argument that it should be rescued by purchase. If museums or collectors could get this stuff out, it was better smuggled than burned. So they started to encourage people and trying to encourage governments to allow it as a policy. But if you buy something to prevent it from being destroyed, you're buying it from the destroyers, who are obviously committing far worse crimes as well. So you're only paying for them to destroy other buildings. And obviously, with the parties to the civil war in Syria, you're paying them to kill people, effectively. You're at least buying their bullets. In Cyprus, they had a very systematic policy of rescue, first of all by purchase, but also by undercover police work. And it led them to not only try to buy fake artifacts like this supposed Syriac Bible, but it also led them to get their police officers trapped and arrested by other police forces because they didn't want to admit that they were doing it in the first place. I do agree with Emma Cunliffe that we can preserve history through documentation and reconstruction and the rescue of the memory, which is obviously the fundamental thing. But sometimes the sites themselves are very important to demonstrating the dark realities that people have lived through. So this is the Armenian city of Van that was destroyed in the genocide. And these are skeletons that were found in a mass grave, again from the Armenian genocide. But when archaeologists tried to record them and to investigate it to demonstrate the evidence for the Armenian genocide, the grave was burned and chemically treated so that it couldn't be documented. And in that way, it prevents us pushing for a recognition of true histories and reconstruction of communities' pasts. But just to close, I think some of the reporting of destruction and targeting of cultural heritage has been jaw-dropping. The Guardian reported that a terrorist cell in Italy had tried to bomb the Vatican, but failed. First of all, they only had a vague idea that they might want to try to bomb the Vatican. They never had an actual plan. Second of all, the terrorists who were arrested were responsible for the bombing of a bazaar in Pakistan where more than 100 people died. but the headline was about the Vatican. It was reported that French police had foiled an imminent terrorist attack on churches in Paris earlier this year. And while I have the greatest respect for the French police, the terrorists themselves foiled the attack by shooting themselves in the leg as they were approaching the site. Yeah, and to close, I mean, in one of the Islamic State's most recent executions, they killed 3 captives in Palmyra who they had tied to some of the columns at the ancient site. And while some people reported it as the murder of 3 captives who'd been tied to Roman columns, some people reported it as the destruction of more of Palmyra, to which some people had been attached. Yeah, I don't know what to say about that, but thank you.
Can I have the microphone here, please? فينا نفتح هذا الميكرو بليز. It's not on.
This one's.
Yeah, we can maybe share this one. We can. Okay, that's fine. Sorry. Maybe we can start by opening the floor, and then I'll just join the discussion if people want to start asking questions. Is there going to be a mic going around?
Yeah, there
okay.
was. Yeah.
So there's someone here.
Hi, thank you. That was very interesting. I was wondering, in the dilemma that you're posing, whether what do you do? Do you actually resort to smuggling the artifacts, or is it better to keep them there and have them destroyed? And I just wanted to ask if you're actually suggesting that the reconstruction of the sites is the better alternative, or what's your thinking on that dilemma?
I think reconstruction is great where possible, but you need to have the documentation to be able to do it. At the moment, they're starting a program of giving people cameras to record the sites so that they can be reconstructed digitally, which is nice in safe places, but not necessary in safe places. And I'm quite worried that they're going to have people putting themselves at risk in order to get the records. I've been told that the cameras are quite identifiable. They're not normal cameras. So, if the people who are destroying these places find someone trying to preserve them, something bad is going to happen, and I'm not sure it's worth the risk for the sake of the building. But I think, in general, yeah, the reconstruction or digital preservation is is the most likely thing that we can do to record these places.
Hi there. I have maybe a comment that I wanted to make. When you spoke about Cyprus, I'm sitting back here. You kind of mentioned as an aside that you're English, but while you were talking about the civil troubles between Turkish Cypriots and Greek Cypriots, you never really mentioned the British involvement as basically the architect of these troubles. And the fact that as it was happening, there was a gigantic British military base on Cyprus, and British army didn't do anything to stop destruction, murder, and all of that. So it becomes a little bit complex, you know, when you don't really acknowledge the position from which you speak. Yeah?
I'm happy to acknowledge, well, not happy, but I'm willing to acknowledge that the British had not only military forces on the island, but a program where they supplied arms to the Turkish Cypriots. They also had their own paramilitary groups on top of their military forces who went round and tortured people. The army itself and the intelligence forces tortured people. In fact, we developed torture in Cyprus that we used in Iraq. And we also used punitive destruction, where we blew up civilian buildings as a punishment for the communities in which the paramilitary forces were operating. Yeah, we didn't do anything in 1974, although we wanted to, because America didn't want us to, and we do what we're told. So we left it to happen.
Hello, that's me, yeah. I just had a question, but first I want to elaborate it through a story that is of an indigenous Canadian legal case against, I think it was British Petroleum or one of these monsters in Canada. And basically the oil company was trying to extract oil from the ground, but the Canadian indigenous community there were saying that it was their land. But of course it was without deeds. So in the law courts, when this went to court and they took the company to court, they began kind of like singing songs and presenting kind of artifact things that would kind of hopefully convince the judge of a kind of continued presence in that place and a way in which the place has kind of evoked history and oral history and carried on these traditions. So the judge replied after listening to the songs that he had a tin ear, that he didn't really appreciate music. But he said that the evidence should be kept for posterity. So he wanted to preserve the kind of cultural artifact of them singing in court, but of course it didn't have any legal standing. So I was thinking about this a lot, that story a lot, when you were talking, Ali, about specters, and also in looking at this kind of negative space of where Daesh had moved the what were they? Wall?
Yeah, the panels. Yeah.
And I was thinking about, so how do you make a case for that kind of negative space, or that kind of non-artifact, or those specters that you were talking about? So how do we argue for those kind of things within?
But I think the problem that exists, it's a system that tries to put mythology versus science, or there's exactly like the example that you gave, and there's many other examples where they had to, in a place of law, in a court or whatever, where you had to face a myth versus science. And I think what's the problem with this is not who would win, or like how to make this argument win over the other argument. What I am suggesting is that this whole structure that should be should be changed, or like that's not this versus that, it's this plus that, or this minus, or whatever it is, another formula that's not one argument against the other. I mean, it's a question also for me. It's a question like, how do you fill these voids? How do you deal in situations like these? But anyway, what I try to look at is like, anyway, we have a problem. I mean, what's happening today, this project that started with modernity now is facing either you can call it a dead end or the collapse of this project. I'm not sure what kind of project could replace this one, but at least let's not try to, and I think like from talking to archaeologists and even the people who are working on Syria and Iraq, whether in Oxford University or the Dutch Archaeological Institute or all these other institutions that are working on these, they're not re-questioning the project itself. What they're thinking is, how do we continue? How do we go one step further? Do we reconstruct? Do we buy it? Do we, you know, like, and all these questions are still in the same logic. And I'm thinking now we have to try to find a different logic. So. There's a question.
Hello, does it work? Yes. I'm sorry because my intervention is not really a question. It's just to say that I'm involved in a project called New Palmyra, and the idea is to gather data about the ancient city of Tadmor and to also create small event where people can discuss and, as you say, go on the discussion and meeting archaeologists, historians, IT people, artists, scientists. And so we did an event in Paris, one in Beirut, and we will do one Friday, the 20th, I think at UNESCO. So maybe if some of you are concerned and we want to have more time, we will have one day to all discuss about this. So I would like to invite you, all of you. The website is newpalmyra.org, and thank you for just listening to me.
Maybe I can ask a question. Well, I know because like most of the people who are working now in Syria and Iraq are working from distance, like yourself or even like Emma Cunliffe, or all these people who are doing just through satellite imagery or by looking at YouTube footage and trying to see bits and pieces of these sites. And I know that the German are doing the Syrian Heritage project, which is they're scanning like all the existing images of historical images of these sites, so people can compare through images. So I want to know like how this new trend, or like where there's lots of money now being put in these projects, which is working from an office in Oxford or I don't know, in Berlin, and assessing damages in Syria and Iraq. Like how do you see this? I don't know, what's your perception of this? I know your blog also about it, so you're also active in this place. So
yeah, it's very odd. I mean, when I was trying to get funding to look at trafficking, I couldn't get anything, and I've applied everywhere from the States to Australia. And then you see millions of pounds being dropped on satellite image analysis in projects in the United States and in the UK. And now a lot more money is going to be spent on documentation and digitization, and next it will be training, and then it'll be education. But very little money, if any, is being spent on targeting the groups who are actually destroying it in any meaningful way. I think the satellite analysis is worthwhile in terms of conflict tracking and that kind of thing. But it's difficult to understand exactly. Say the Americans have now got a $5 million reward for anyone who gives them information about traffickers who work with the Islamic State, but not traffickers who work with Jabhat al-Nusra or the Free Syrian Army or the Assad regime or any other terrorist group around the world. And it seems quite a strange way of fighting political violence if you have that limited a focus.
There's another question I wanted to ask about. Is the commission lootings? How do you call
theft, like theft to order? Yeah,
theft to order. Can you explain this?
It's something that hasn't really been acknowledged a lot, or it's even been denied, that you would have dealers and collectors who would hire looters to go and steal specific objects or to loot specific sites. But it's come out increasingly through the Syrian war and elsewhere that even the armed groups will take orders over Skype or WhatsApp. Jabhat al-Nusra were smuggling Westerners into Syria for a few days at a time, just for them to extract antiquities and then leave again. But other groups, whether Free Syrian Army fighters or other armed groups within the conflict would get on their smartphone and hook up with a collector through an app, and they would agree to steal a specific object. You know, if they sent them a photograph of the thing they wanted, then they'd go and take it. Or if they told them which site to get sculptures from, they would go and take it and then ship it around the world to wherever the collector was based. And because there's virtually no customs checks on ships, it just goes straight in and disappears into the private market. Partly because no one's putting money into it, it's difficult to prove because we're basically dependent upon journalists.
So I was told by an antique dealer that it would be very hard to put on the market a piece that was sold, that it would practically be unsellable, and that it would be very hard for this group to make, because the claim was that this was their second source of income.
Yeah, the second source thing is bullshit.
Yeah,
but
that's what I've been told too. But so you're basing these smuggling stories on proofs, indicators, documents, what's up that people saw, or what are the material that we have to say that these antiques have been smuggled, and or I mean, what is the reality of it?
Early on in the conflict, the Free Syrian Army actually advertised that they were looting. They would telling journalists that they had excavation teams that were going out to target archaeological sites. Apparently, more recently, they've got better media advisors, so they've stopped saying it, but I suspect they're still doing it. Otherwise, people have recorded them in conversation where they've been offering objects, and they've shown them over Skype. Skype's very good because there's no record, so it's very difficult for the police to track it. But there are recordings of things being offered over Skype. And another testimony. In Lebanon, the police found sculptures from Palmyra being sold for $200,000 each. It's true that it's more difficult for a dealer to sell a more famous piece very publicly, but most things aren't sold publicly at all. And if you launder the object by selling it quietly a few times in London, then you can pretend, oh, it came from an old family collection, but they lost the paperwork. But we have no reason to believe that it was taken out of Syria this year, and the police can't do anything. So it's true that it's a bit more difficult sometimes, some places, but I don't like to say it, but it's very easy to loot and smuggle objects.
But I think also, sorry, one of the things is that they are also now digging in sites. So there are things that are being dug out of that are not documented, and these are much easier to sell because there's no trace of what was found there, because there's lots of sites that are not completely excavated. And this with the satellite imagery, I think you could see that, like the looting holes, that how many there are, and that's the only thing archaeologists can know, that there have been looting on this side, but they cannot know what was found.
I wanted to ask two quick questions. One is those two headlines that you showed at the end, I mean, are really effective in showing sort of different perspective, but given if you're saying that you're heavily dependent on journalists for the information that they're finding, I mean, what I know, and you sort of ended on not wanting to get into this point, but what kind of balance would you argue for in journalist reporting on the conflict of how to balance between, you know, the loss of human life and the loss of cultural heritage? And then the second question is, I was told a story recently about a very prominent archaeologist who's a scholar who works in Syria, who's no longer taking graduate students because she feels they won't ever be able to go, they won't be able to work on site. Is there a danger of sort of scholarly and academic and like expertise disengaging from the situation completely because it's so complicated and horrific?
I don't think it should be too difficult for journalists to cover it, as long as they remember that they probably should be focusing on civilian life. I think a lot of journalists do very well, like Karim Shaheen has been doing great work, and Mike Giglio, and it is difficult because if you don't have a story about people being killed and objects being destroyed at the same time, if you are only reporting on destruction, you will inevitably get a lot of people saying, why are you reporting this rather than that? But I think that, you know, they can make the argument that these are attacks on identity. A lot of it is genocidal destruction. The Yazidi temples very rarely get included in propaganda and therefore very rarely get discussed by the media, but a lot of them were destroyed. And it shows that the attacks on the cultural heritage are attacks on the communities themselves. And the second one was... Oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah, in the past, the archaeologists were quite happy to just move to the next door country. There are a lot of archaeologists who worked in Cyprus who used to work in Israel and Palestine, but left after the '67 war. Yeah, now they're a bit warier about moving to the next door country because that isn't too secure either. So they've started doing satellite images. But it's possible that they could disengage, but they should still be able to teach the archaeology and history of a place without actually excavating it themselves. I mean, historians don't have to stop teaching things because they can't visit the country. Hopefully they won't disengage, but I guess we'll see in a few years. So I was wondering, with the caretaker in Sharjah, how did he end up being the caretaker, and how did people respond to you, like to him doing it and you working with him?
I'm not sure if he chose this way. Probably because he's been like living there for 20 years. So probably when he arrived, like it was, I assume that was offered to him. He doesn't have any training in like anything archaeological, and from the fact that he's living there throughout the year, so whenever there are archaeologists coming to dig in these areas, he would join them, like because they need workmen. But the situation, I think, in the Emirates quite particular because, like all the workmen that are working, like the handmen that are on the sites, are non-Emirati. There's now starting to have like the missions, like foreign missions, will collaborate with local authorities, but still, like there's very few archaeologists. There's like from the local people. I think there's none that is willing to work really on digging or on the site actually. So the work happens really like on a bureaucratic level or like assessments or like museology and all this. So yeah, so I mean it's a situation quite particular because he's Pakistani living in the Sharjah desert for 20 years, guarding these ruins. He lives like in this small shack in the desert, and at the same time it's a place where also they found artifacts that are coming from Pakistan. So it has a certain link, at least through history. It is a place where he was able to leave a trace or like have some sort of engagement, while today, like if he leaves tomorrow and they can just take out the house where he's living and he'll completely disappear. So yeah, so that's one of the interests also going to make him the center of the film. But if you come tomorrow, you'll see it.
Yeah. Well, I think they're going to...
I have two questions. For this area of the Gulf, we have never had any history, we have been talked about it. So which part of history it comes from, this area of the Gulf?
You mean... of course,
the
there's
ruins.
Sorry?
The ruins are coming from which
the ruins, these are settlements, 5,000-year-old settlements, because in the desert where I was working, there was water, because now actually there's a very big project in Saudi Arabia, and in Rub' al-Khali, which used to be, they're calling it, I think, the Green Desert Project or something like this, which they tried to trace back when there was water in all this area, and there were settlements, and I was just saying that they're on the trade route between India and Europe, so it was a very active also, like a point in history. So the places are 3,000, 4,000, 5,000-year-old. Then when these places became more arid and people had to leave more to other places, then they lost the trace. And actually what's interesting there is most of the, like at least recently, most of the things they were finding were tombs, because tombs used to be on the around the mountains, like the Rocky Mountains that are in the desert. So the earth is more stable, and that's why it's easier to find skeleton or skeletal remains in this type of earth than in the middle of the desert, where like the landscape changed a lot, and it's much harder. But now they're doing now like magnetic scanning of the desert. I know the German that I'm working with, they're scanning the desert in Saudi Arabia, so magnetic scanning, and then they're finding a lot of new places that they never thought that there were settlements there.
Okay. So it doesn't have to do anything with civilization in this area? The Roman, the Greeks?
No, it goes further. I mean, I'm not sure. I'm not going to answer. I'm not sure. I'm not sure, like, the whole historical historical line of what different cultures were living there.
Okay, thank you. And I have a question for you. We only talk about consequences, what happened, destroying and so on. Why don't we talk of the source? Who is letting these people do such things and why? Who is financing these people to destroy? And what are their target for this? Nobody talks about it. Just talk about destruction and everything was stolen, but nobody talks about who is behind these people to destroy, to take all the civilization 1,000 years ago.
It's very difficult to identify who's funding them. I mean, it's clear that they have lots of different sources. A lot of it is money they've just stolen from the local communities because they've confiscated basically all of the assets in all of the territories they have. Like any would-be empire, they have to keep expanding because they have to keep taking in resources. They probably do. They do have outside backers as well, but it's difficult to prove who is giving them money, and that's why it's difficult to talk about who's funding them and why.
Yes, why? The purpose. Why? Why they want to destroy all these
I think there are maybe three basic reasons. Partly, it is ideological. I mean, they do genuinely believe in the destruction of iconic images. But obviously, because they're also allowing things to be sold or selling things themselves, they don't absolutely believe in the need to destroy every image, which suggests that one of the other motives is economic. Partly, they destroy things as they're looting them. Partly, it's like, I guess, maybe the difference between ethnic cleansing and genocide. When they destroy this stuff, a lot of it is genocide. But when they have it smuggled out of the territory, it functions like ethnic cleansing. Maybe they'd prefer to destroy it, but at the very least, it's not in their area anymore. So their area is pure. And they make money and purify the area at the same time. But then also it's strategic. It is terrorism. It terrifies people to see their holy places being destroyed, to see their homes being destroyed. They know that it causes refugee flows, which benefits them several times over. First of all, because there are fewer people to control, but also because it makes the refugee crisis worse in the places that are against them. And even the refugee crisis itself turns societies against each other. The way the UK is not welcoming to refugees from Syria, even though we are supposed to be on the same side as the refugees. And it makes it difficult for Italy and Greece to cope because they don't have the resources to support the refugees. which makes them more nationalistic, and it leads to a lot of violence within Greece, especially from neo-Nazis. And that violence then feeds into the kind of extremism that sends people to join the Islamic State. And that's why I think quite a lot from the UK and from France have gone to join the fighters, because the extreme atmosphere that's provoked by things like the refugee crisis, which is created by them and by Assad. Yeah.
Thank you.